Close your eyes and let your mind slip backward, not decades, not centuries, but into the deep, dark spine of medieval time, a world where faith was iron, swords were scripture, and every breath might be your last or your salvation. Tonight, I will take you into a true story so strange, so intense, it sounds like legend, yet it is carved into the bones of Europe and the sands of the Holy Land. This is not a tale of heroes and villains. This is a tale of kings who wept, monks who bled, and cities that prayed as they burned. This is the Second Crusade. It begins not in glory, but in collapse. The year is 1144. In the east, the proud city of Edessa, firstborn of the Crusader states, has fallen, not to fire alone, nor to treachery, but to a man as feared as he was disciplined Zengi of Mosul, with a banner of crescent moons and an army forged in holy war. He has breached the Christian frontier. The West reels. Whispers fly through cathedrals like curses. If Edessa falls, what of Antioch? What of Jerusalem? So the Pope raises his voice, not in quiet prayer, but in command. He calls for a new crusade, not of dusty pilgrims, but of kings. And kings answer: Louis of France, Conrad of Germany, their crowns heavy with guilt, pride, and prophecy. Behind them ride thousands, knights hungry for redemption, nobles drunk on legacy, and peasants seeking miracle or martyrdom. Some chase salvation, others chase silver. All will be changed. But this is no holy march. It is a descent into chaos, betrayal, and bitter reckoning. Because this time, the enemy is not just across the desert. He may be riding beside you. The news of Edessa's fall hits Christendom like thunder rolling through a monastery's cloister. In every candlelit abbey and rain-swept cathedral, priests lower their heads in dread. This is not just the loss of a city, it is the unraveling of the great dream born during the First Crusade. The Holy Land, once secured by the blood of martyrs, now trembles beneath Muslim retaliation. Pope Eugene III, newly elected and burdened by the shadow of failure, reaches for a voice louder than his own. He turns to Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard, the Cistercian monk whose words have moved armies and humbled kings, climbs the pulpits of Europe like a prophet of old. His voice is not fire, it is frost, still and chilling. He speaks of heavenly reward and eternal damnation. He promises forgiveness for the burdened soul, glory for the fallen knight, and salvation for the faithful. And they come. Tens of thousands. From vineyards and fishing ports, from castles and plague-stricken towns. They come with rusted swords and shattered hopes. Not all are warriors. Some are old men who remember the First Crusade. Others are children who've only heard its songs. Most have never left their villages. Few know where Edessa lies. But they carry with them the cross stitched into cloaks, carved into shields, branded into flesh, in France. King Louis VII burns with guilt. Years earlier, he had ordered the massacre of peasants in Vitry-sur-Marne during a petty conflict, locking hundreds in a church and watching it burn. He sees this crusade as penance. In Germany, King Conrad III, stern, battle-scarred, and haunted by dynastic failure, joins with reluctant resolve. The empire is fractured, the nobility fractious, but the call of God and the opportunity for glory binds their ambitions for now. 2 kings, 2 armies, 1 mission to reclaim what has been lost and defend what remains. But the way east is no simple march. The journey to the east begins not with swords, but with suspicion. Conrad's German forces are the first to set out in the spring of 1147. They march through Hungary, where uneasy truces must be made, then into the lands of the Byzantine Empire, Christian, yes, but Greek and proud, and far from welcoming. Byzantine Emperor Manuel I Komnenos sees the Crusaders not as brothers in Christ, but as dangerous guests. He remembers all too well the First Crusade, when Western knights rampaged through Constantinople like wild beasts dressed in holy cloth. Manuel fears not only their presence, but their intent. And he has reason. German knights, less restrained than their leaders, plunder as they go. They are hungry, tired, and untrusting. In return, Byzantine guides lead them down poor roads, away from the grain-rich plains. Food grows scarce, tempers rise. When Louis and the French arrive months later, the pattern repeats. Manuel welcomes the king but closes his gates to the army. Negotiations become thinly veiled threats. Louis tries diplomacy. His queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine, captivates the court with her beauty and wit, but even she cannot ease the tension between East and West. Still, the crusade presses forward. From Constantinople, the path leads into Anatolia, land of harsh sun, jagged hills, and Turkish archers whose arrows kill from shadows. There, the dream begins to die. At Dorylaeum, the Germans are ambushed. The Seljuk Turks, masters of terrain and tactics, surround them. Arrows blot the sky. Horsemen ride like ghosts through the dust. Panic breaks the line. Men flee. The noble banner of the Holy Roman Empire falls into the dirt, trampled beneath bloodied boots. Conrad survives, wounded and humiliated. His army, once tens of thousands, is now a remnant. Louis fares little better. He follows in Conrad's path, trusting Byzantine guides who may or may not be loyal. At Mount Cadmus, his army too is caught in narrow defiles. Packs of Turkish raiders pick them off like wolves among sheep. Supplies are lost. Horses die. Men drown trying to cross rivers swollen with spring melt. And then, there is the snow. Anatolia's winter is cruel. French knights sleep in armor crusted with ice. Fires burn weakly. Hunger creeps into bone. Eleanor, once regal, now rides through frostbitten lands with a dwindling train of servants and a look hardened by survival. When they finally reach the coast and the city of Italia, the Crusaders are broken, starved, bitter, and angry. Conrad takes a ship back to Constantinople. Louis continues to Antioch. But the unity of Christendom has shattered. The Great Crusade, once envisioned as a tide of righteous vengeance, now limps toward Jerusalem like a beggar with a bruised crown. In Antioch, the reception is anything but simple. Raymond of Poitiers, Prince of Antioch, is family to Eleanor. Her uncle and his court welcomes the Crusaders with a flair that borders on theatrical. The city, still holding remnants of Roman grandeur and Levantine decadence, offers the weary knights warmth, wine, and whispers. And those whispers grow loud. Raymond argues that Louis should strike at Aleppo, a key Turkish stronghold. A swift campaign there could cut the heart from the enemy and secure northern Syria for Christendom. But Louis hesitates. His mind, shaped by the pilgrimage's failures and the pressure of the church, is fixed on Jerusalem, the sacred city, the emotional center of the crusade. Eleanor, fiery and strategic, supports Raymond. Some say too strongly. Rumors stir of late-night councils, of long walks along Antioch's moonlit walls, of a bond deeper than diplomacy. Whether true or false, they plant seeds of suspicion. Louis, already weakened in body and spirit, grows cold. He rebuffs Raymond, accuses Eleanor of impropriety, and forces her to leave the city under guard. Their marriage, once a symbol of French power, now hangs by a thread. The crusade limps south. Gone are the grand dreams of conquest. What remains is a bruised procession of knights and pilgrims, their armor dulled, their prayers weary. In Jerusalem, they are received with solemn ceremony. The Patriarch of Jerusalem blesses them. King Baldwin III offers feasts. But beneath the pageantry lies discontent. The local Crusader lords, hardened by years in the Levant, view the European kings with polite disdain. These are not saviors, they are guests too late. Still, action must be taken. And so the plan forms to strike at Damascus. It is a city of immense importance, strategically located, rich in culture, and perhaps most crucial an ally of sorts to the Crusader states. But politics shifts like sand. Recent tensions make Damascus a tempting target. If conquered, it could form a buffer against Nur ad-Din and his growing power in Aleppo. The plan is flawed from the start. The Crusader armies, numbering some 50,000 at their peak, march east in the blistering heat of summer. They reach Damascus not as liberators, but as invaders. The gardens around the city, once lush, carefully tended, even shared with Crusaders in times of truce, are trampled, burned, seized. Damascenes resist fiercely. The Crusaders launch a siege, but coordination fails. Supplies dwindle. The water grows foul. Miscommunication between the French and German contingents sparks internal feuding. The city holds, and then, unexpectedly, the Crusaders retreat. 4 days into the siege, with no decisive blow struck, they turn back. Whispers swirl bribery, treachery, fear. No official explanation satisfies the men who marched across continents for this moment. They return bitter, defeated, their faith in leaders shattered. Louis and Conrad leave the Holy Land soon after, their crusade a failure in all but name. They return not as heroes, but as reminders of ambition overmatched by reality. And back in Edessa, the walls remain breached. The city is gone. News of the retreat spreads like wildfire through the Crusader states, at castles and camps from Acre to Tyre. Stunned silence gives way to murmurs of betrayal. The greatest Christian monarchs of the age had crossed continents to retake Edessa, to punish the infidels, to reclaim glory. And yet they had marched in, wandered aimlessly, and turned back before the first true wall could fall. For the common soldiers, those who had left homes in Burgundy, Swabia, Saxony, and Normandy, there is no consolation. They had watched friends die on the Anatolian passes, buried brothers in the sands outside Damascus, only to retreat under banners that once stood for holy vengeance. Some desert, others linger in the Holy Land, joining smaller garrisons or marrying into local Christian communities, but a great many begin the journey home. Their departure is marked not by procession or song, but by a sullen march under skies that seem to mock their ambition. In Jerusalem, the patriarch sighs beneath vaulted ceilings. He pens letters to Rome, to Cluny, to Canterbury. His words are heavy with frustration. The failure of the Second Crusade is not just a military loss, it is spiritual disillusionment. If kings cannot lead God's army to victory, then what hope remains for the faithful? And in Edessa, or rather, what remains of it? Nur ad-Din watches from his tower. He had not needed to lift a blade in this campaign. His enemies had undone themselves, with Damascus spared, with the Crusader alliance fractured, and with Europe now weary of Eastern ventures. The path for Islamic resurgence lies wide open. His scholars proclaim it divine justice. His generals sharpen their swords. The jihad is no longer defensive, it is righteous. It is ascendant. It is patient. Meanwhile, Eleanor of Aquitaine, sailing home with Louis, stares out at the Mediterranean horizon. Her marriage is broken, her authority questioned, but her mind is alight. The crusade may have failed in arms, but not in lessons. She has seen the courts of the East, the politics of princes, the dangers of blind piety, and she has plans. Back in France, back in Aquitaine, she will shape the future. Louis, silent beside her, contemplates his own legacy. He had worn the cross with pride, prayed with fervour, sacrificed more than most, and yet his name would be etched in history not as Louis the Crusader, but Louis the Failed. In the coming years, troubadours will compose mournful ballads of the Second Crusade songs of dust and blood, of betrayal and disillusionment. Children will learn of the kings who came with trumpets and left with silence, and the Holy Land will wait. It will wait for new armies, for new saints and sinners, for new crusades driven by zeal and revenge. But for now, it mourns. The Red Cross still flutters over battered tents. Pilgrims still kneel before relics in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and in the shadows beyond the walls, new banners rise green, bold, unafraid. The crusade is not over. It has merely changed hands. In Europe, the shock of failure reverberates slowly. Papal messengers carry word of the Second Crusade's end with careful phrasing minimizing disaster, emphasizing piety. But word spreads. In taverns and churches from Paris to Cologne, stories leak of lost cities, infighting between kings, the humiliation before Damascus's gates. Some call it God's punishment for pride. Others whisper darker theories that the Eastern princes never intended victory, that Eleanor bewitched her husband, that the Templars sabotaged the siege. Conspiracy and grief, as always, walk hand in hand. Monasteries begin to receive disillusioned knights, those who lay down their swords not for peace, but for penance. A knight returns to his manor in Normandy, changed, silent, haunted by the eyes of a boy slain in the name of Christ. A squire becomes a monk. A lord sells his land to fund chapels for the dead. The preaching for the next crusade halts. The fervour cools, and the Saracens watch. For Nur ad-Din, the vacuum of Western retreat offers golden opportunity. He consolidates control over Aleppo and Damascus. He mints coins with his name, builds schools of law and mosques of astonishing beauty. But make no mistake, his peace is strategic. Beneath the civility lies ambition to unite the Muslim world under one banner, one sword, one purpose. To the Christian eye, Nur ad-Din is the new Saladin before Saladin. Patient, cunning, devout. He grants tax relief to merchants, encourages scholarship, and makes alliances not with emotion, but with calculation. His court is not a den of indulgence, but a forge of empire. In contrast, the Crusader states fracture further. The kingdom of Jerusalem is ruled by weak kings, distracted by domestic power struggles and succession crises. Antioch broods under Bohemon's erratic heirs. Tripoli weathers petty wars and shifting alliances. And Edessa, once the first Crusader foothold in the east, is gone, its churches desecrated, its walls dismantled, its survivors scattered or slain. Even the Byzantines, who had once hoped to benefit from Western campaigns, begin to distance themselves. Emperor Manuel Komnenos strengthens the empire's borders and watches the West with wary contempt. To him, the Crusaders were never saviors, only chaotic interlopers, wielding crosses like cudgels and leaving ruin in their wake. Back in Rome, Pope Eugenius III ages quickly. The crusade he had blessed, the kings he had emboldened all, had fallen short. His vision of a united Christendom lies in tatters. Still, he refuses despair. A papal bull is drafted. The call will be renewed, in time, but not yet. Europe needs to forget. It needs to bury the shame beneath prayers and parchment, beneath restructured treaties and solemn masses. The scar will fade, but never fully. Among the scattered survivors returning from the east, tales twist with each retelling. Some say angels turned their backs during the siege of Damascus. Others speak of traitors in the ranks, Franks who betrayed their own for silver, or for promises whispered in Arabic. Memory becomes myth, and myth, in time, replaces truth. In the courts of Europe, embarrassment lingers beneath the pomp. Louis returns to France a king unvictorious, his crown tarnished though still adorned. Eleanor's political capital shrinks. Whispers swirl about her independence, her boldness, her influence over military decisions. In time, their union phrase. The cracks formed on Levantine soil will one day become an abyss. In Germany, Conrad's retreat is met with prayers, but also with questions. Why had so many noblemen perished? Why had God allowed it preachers quiet their tongues? The pulpit, once aflame with crusading zeal, now preaches humility and repentance. But not all hearts grow cold. In secret, in scripture, in silence, the flame of crusade still smoulders. Far to the east, in Mosul, Nur ad-Din watches with hawk's eyes. He does not waste his enemy's retreat. While the Franks rebuild walls in Antioch, he rebuilds trust among divided emirs. He commissions schools of hadith, courts jurists, and invites poets. Yet even his generosity has a sharp edge. In one town, he funds the rebuilding of a mosque destroyed by crusaders. In another, he sponsors a hospital for wounded soldiers, both Muslim and Christian, though the latter are swiftly encouraged to convert. His reputation grows not merely a warrior, but a just ruler, a true mujahid. The memory of Edessa, however, haunts both sides. Christians whisper of its loss like a wound left untreated. Muslims remember its fall as a signal of divine favor. The city itself lies quiet, its churches repurposed or leveled, its graveyards vast. The monks who once copied Bibles now labor under Islamic tax. Those who refused fled, wandered, or vanished. And yet, some remain silent witnesses to the change, chroniclers of a new order. In Jerusalem, King Baldwin III inherits a throne under siege politically and geographically. He is young, ambitious, and caught between aging advisors and suspicious lords. His reign begins not with glory, but with repairs to walls, to laws, to trust. Jerusalem, the heart of Christian dreams, now stands vulnerable. It watches the borders, it scans the sea, it fears the next wave. For even in its piety, the city senses that faith alone will not hold the walls. Within the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, candles flicker over the tombs said to belong to Christ. Pilgrims still come, though fewer than before. They kneel, they weep, they light wax in silence. Outside, guards with crossbows watch the alleys. The sacred and the military walk side by side. Yet not all suffering from the failed crusade lies on distant battlefields. In the small towns of Provence, in the merchant halls of Lubeck, in the chapels of Burgundy, fathers do not return. Widows count rosary beads with trembling fingers. Sons ask questions no priest dares to answer. Letters, months delayed and blood-stained, tell of comrades lost to Saracen swords or starvation, of ships sunk by storms, of men broken not by steel, but by despair. The silence from the east is as heavy as the news it carries, and across Europe, the dream dims. The noble cause that once united kings now births factionalism. Crusader taxes meant to fund God's war become excuses for crown coffers to swell. Knights who gave their lands to the church in exchange for salvation return home to find those lands withheld. Lawyers argue, bishops demur. Salvation, it seems, can be negotiated. The voice of Bernard of Clairvaux, once thundering from pulpits, is now quieter. He writes letters of contrition. He blames the sin of the Crusaders, not their cause. But his critics grow louder. If God willed it, they ask, why did we fail in Italy? City-states that profited from shipping Crusaders east now squabble over tariffs and territories. Venice eyes the sea lanes. Genoa readies its docks. Faith may steer the soul, but profit steers the rudder. And in the shadows of monasteries, chroniclers scratch out cautious lines. The Second Crusade, they write, was not as the first. The unity was weaker, the vision blurred, the enemies wiser. But even failure does not stop time. Children are born during the years of retreat. They grow up never knowing the holy fire that once swept across Europe. Their stories begin not with glory, but with caution, with tales of heat and hunger, of foreign tongues and empty promises. They grow into a world still marked by the cross, but now with cracks in its foundation. In the Levant, those cracks widen, old alliances fracture. The Principality of Antioch bickers with Tripoli. The Latin kingdom mistrusts its own lords. Every garrison is undermanned, every truce fragile, and watching from the east, Nur ad-Din prepares. He does not gloat. He prays. He studies. He builds. The Islamic world, once fractured by the tides of Seljuk ambition and local jealousies, begins to bend toward unity, not through brute force, but through vision. Nur ad-Din speaks not of conquest, but of justice. He funds scholars. He repairs aqueducts. He defends mosques rebuilt from rubble. His soldiers call him Amir al-Mu'mineen, commander of the faithful. His enemies call him dangerous. In secret Christian councils, his name rises more often than that of kings. And in Jerusalem, when scouts return with news of troop movements near Homs or Aleppo, Baldwin listens with narrowed eyes. The next crusade is not yet born, but its father is, in Paris. Candles flicker in cathedral chapels where nobles kneel beside peasants, each murmuring their own version of why the crusade failed. Was it pride? Was it greed? Or had God turned his face away? These questions stir not only sermons, but poetry. Troubadours weave melancholy verses that drift from the halls of Aquitaine to the streets of Marseille. Their songs speak of brave knights lost in distant sands, of relics buried beneath ruined ramparts, of love letters never answered. The romantic glory once pinned to the First Crusade now bears a more sorrowful hue. And yet, amid the sorrow, ambition festers. Not all are content to mourn. In courts across Europe, ambitious men and women plot new futures. Kings eye weakened lords returning from the east, their power diminished, their coffers drained. Marriages are renegotiated, land is seized. The absence of crusaders has created vacuums, and where power wanes, vultures gather. In England, Henry Plantagenet watches carefully. His ascension is still fresh, his grasp on power still brittle. But the lessons from Edessa and Damascus are not lost on him. Religion may inspire, but real power lies in grain, in silver, in ships, in Sicily. King Roger II charts a different path. A patron of scholars and scientists, he welcomes Greek, Arab, and Latin thinkers into his court. He sees that wisdom, not war, may shape empires more lastingly. His maps of the world are the finest in Europe, drawn by Muslims, annotated by Christians. To him, the Crusades' failure is not an end, but proof that unity by blade alone is folly. Meanwhile, in monasteries from Cluny to Canterbury, a quiet crisis brews. Faith, though still strong, now carries shadows. Novices question not God, but the men who claim to speak for him. The relic trade booms, every abbey claims a bone, a vial, a splinter. And the faithful, desperate for certainty, pay dearly for hope in tangible form. In Jerusalem, Queen Melisende navigates court intrigue with grace and steel. Her authority is often questioned by foreign lords, but never twice. She governs not by divine right alone, but with a cunning that belies the delicate veil she wears. Her palace is one of mosaics, spies, and silks where alliances are formed over pomegranate wine and broken by whispers behind tapestries. She knows, as few others do, that the Latin kingdom stands on a precipice. One more blow, and it may fall not to sword or siege, but to silence and forgetfulness. Back in Edessa, where it all began, the Muslim Crescent now rises undisturbed above the city walls. Churches have been converted. Latin graffiti fades under new inscriptions. The bells that once called crusaders to prayer are melted down to cast new weapons. And in the minds of both Christians and Muslims, a new idea begins to stir. The Holy Land is not just a battlefield, it is a mirror. It reflects what each side fears and hopes. It is both promise and warning. And its silence, for now, is the loudest sound in Christendom. On the roads of France, pilgrims and returning crusaders cross paths. One limps barefoot from Santiago, clutching a scallop shell. The other rides a weary mule from Antioch, armor rusted and eyes hollow. Their journeys were different, yet both claimed to seek salvation. They nod to each other with understanding born not of shared experience, but of shared exhaustion. In marketplaces, tales grow taller. A butcher's cousin who went to the Holy Land is now said to have slain 100 Saracens and bathed in the Jordan. A blacksmith insists his brother found the spear of Longinus in a cave outside Edessa. These are stories wrapped in awe and envy half believed, wholly repeated. Yet for many, these tales are more than fantasy. They offer hope. If the Holy Land is not yet won, then at least it still exists as myth, as goal, as moral test, and that belief fuels the next generation. Boys play at Crusade in the fields. Girls whisper prayers for knights not yet born. In stone churches and straw huts alike, dreams of redemption fester and bloom. The church, ever vigilant, sees an opportunity. The papacy begins preparing the groundwork for what will become the Second Crusade. This time, they promise, it will be organized, disciplined, righteous. This time, it will succeed. Letters are dispatched. Bishops preach sermons ablaze with imagery fire, brimstone, and the beauty of martyrdom. Monks take to the roads with crosses and relics. In Mainz, Bernard of Clairvaux emerges, gaunt and wild-eyed, his voice thunderous. His words do not just stir hearts, they bend wills. Men drop their tools mid-harvest, nobles mortgage lands. Children listen at church doors, eyes wide. The call has begun anew, not from kings or emperors, but from pulpit and passion. And yet, not all are convinced. In the Rhineland, Jewish communities remember the violence of the First Crusade, the pogroms, the forced baptisms, the slaughter. As rumors of a new crusade grow, they begin to prepare, some by flight, some by bribery, some by hiding their children beneath floorboards. History, for them, is not an epic, it is a warning. Meanwhile, in the courts of the Muslim world, news of Christian unrest arrives with spice caravans and captured merchants. Nur ad-Din, son of Zengi, surveys maps of Syria and thinks not of Europe's religion, but of its hunger. He understands that crusaders come not only for faith, but for land, for loot, for glory. He also knows that time favors the patient, and he is very patient. In Constantinople, the Byzantine emperor watches the stirrings in the west with caution. He remembers the chaos of the last crusade, the looting, the arrogance, the unintended consequences. He offers promises of support, tempered by demands for loyalty. He prepares his ambassadors, not just with gifts, but with contracts and traps. Back in Rome, the Pope sharpens his rhetoric. The Holy Land, he says, must not remain in infidel hands. It is a stain upon Christendom, a challenge to divine order, and most dangerously, a test. If Christians fail to respond, he warns, then God may turn his favor elsewhere. The fear is not just of loss, it is of irrelevance. In noble halls, banners are unfurled once more, armor is mended, heirs are chosen to stay behind, to guard what might be lost. Wives sew crosses onto cloaks and whisper prayers into iron helmets. And across Europe, the ground begins to tremble not with hoofbeats yet, but with intent. The Second Crusade is coming, and with it, another chapter written in fire and faith. In Rome, papal scribes prepare new decrees. The call to arms must be refined. This time, they vow, the crusade will not be a mob, but a movement, a spiritual march organized by God's own hierarchy. The failures of the past, They reason, we're not in the cause, but in the chaos. Orders go out for new sermons, clearer directives, stricter codes for recruitment. The lessons of Edessa are painful, but instructive. Yet while kings and clerics debate doctrine, the people dream. In the villages of Castile, in the manors of Normandy, in the vineyards of the Rhine, men and women whisper of redemption. A cousin still held captive, a relic still lost, a wound still open. These private griefs stitch themselves into a common tapestry, and beneath it all, always the holy city looms. Jerusalem, not merely a place, but a promise, the weight of prophecy, the pull of myth. Pilgrims still travel, though fewer than before, braving pirates, pestilence, and the wrath of local lords. Those who return are honored, scarred, and sometimes silent. And beyond all this, winds of change stir elsewhere. In the east, Nur ad-Din's influence widens. Aleppo flourishes under his rule not with decadence, but with purpose. Mosques are repaired, courts reformed, taxes are collected fairly comparatively. His justice, though stern, is spoken of with respect. Even his enemies concede this is no petty emir. He builds hospitals, funds scholars, dispatches troops only when strategy dictates. He speaks softly, but carries the Quran in one hand and the sword in the other. To his people, he is not just a ruler, he is a sign. To the Christians of Outremer, he is an omen. And as winter turns to spring, and spring to another campaign season, scouts report strange movements near the Orontes River. Supply lines grow thick. Tribes once disunited now answer a common call. The Latin kingdom of Jerusalem braces. Its walls are patched, its wells inspected, its knights summoned. Yet something more ominous than war hovers in the air: uncertainty. For the first time since the First Crusade, the Franks no longer believe victory is certain. They build not for expansion, but for survival. Every castle is a question, every truce a fragile thread. And in this tension, the first seeds of the next great reckoning are sown. In the shadow of Edessa's fall and the confusion of the failed Second Crusade, the Muslim world began to shift. For decades, the Islamic response to the Crusader invasion had been fragmented rival dynasties, ambitious emirs, and sultans more concerned with each other than with the Christian invaders. But from this chaos emerged a figure unlike any before Nur ad-Din Mahmud, son of Zengi, the stern and devout ruler who would become the architect of jihad and the mentor of legends. Where his father had ruled with cruelty and command, Nur ad-Din added piety and principle. He saw in the Crusader states not just foreign occupation, but an insult to the faith. While Christian knights drank and duelled in stone castles, Nur ad-Din fasted, prayed, and rebuilt. His court in Aleppo was modest, no gold fountains or perfumed halls. Instead, scholars and poets gathered in the cool shade of stone, where the call to prayer echoed louder than music. Nur ad-Din funded madrasas, hospitals, and orphanages, not just to glorify his name, but to serve the people he saw as entrusted to him by God. But he was not only a scholar king, he was a strategist. First, he moved to secure Damascus, the jewel of Syria, long contested and coveted. After careful negotiation and military maneuvering, he entered the city not as a conqueror, but as a guardian. Unlike his father, who took by force, Nur ad-Din often took by trust. He would be called al-Malik al-Adil, the just king. Once Damascus and Aleppo were united under his banner, the balance of power shifted. For the first time, the Muslim Near East had a leader who could match the Crusader states in strength and surpass them in legitimacy. He reorganized armies, punished corruption, and cultivated loyalty not with fear, but with shared purpose. And that purpose was clear to push the Franks from the Holy Land. Nur ad-Din launched raids into the Kingdom of Jerusalem, sieging fortresses, disrupting trade, and capturing territory bit by bit. His forces avoided major confrontations, instead favoring calculated strikes and strategic alliances. He forged ties with local Arab tribes and even some Christian minorities who preferred his justice to Frankish taxes. Yet, Nur ad-Din knew the long game could not be played only in Syria. The key to defeating the Crusader states lay in Egypt, the rich fractured land to the south still ruled by the declining Fatimid Caliphate. Whoever controlled Egypt would control the Crusaders' flank and threaten their supply lines. He sent emissaries, then generals. Among them was a Kurdish officer, Shirkuh, rotund and ruthless, and by his side, a young man who watched, learned, and waited, Yusuf ibn Ayyub, better known to the world as Saladin. But in these early years, Saladin was just a nephew following orders, a shadow among giants. While Shirkuh and Saladin ventured into Egyptian politics, Nur ad-Din kept Syria steady. He resisted the temptation of empire for the reality of consolidation. He avoided direct confrontation with the Franks unless the odds favored him, and he waited, for his enemies would overreach. And when they did, Nur ad-Din would not hesitate. He was not a man of charisma, but of consequence. And in the halls of power and the silence of prayer, he forged the foundation for what would become the greatest Islamic resurgence of the medieval age. While Nur ad-Din consolidated power in Syria and plotted against the Crusaders, events in Egypt began to spiral into a chaotic whirlwind of opportunity. The Fatimid Caliphate, Shia in doctrine and rotting from within, had long been a tempting prize for both Crusader kings and Muslim emirs. Egypt's wealth was undeniable, its Nile-fed fields fed millions, and its coffers overflowed with gold. But its sultans were weak, their viziers conniving, and their army split between Turkic mercenaries and Berber tribesmen. Into this disarray stepped Shirkuh, Nur ad-Din's general, dispatched to influence the Egyptian court and prevent a Crusader takeover. With him was Saladin, still quiet, still underestimated. Their mission to prevent Egypt from falling into the hands of Amalric III, the ambitious king of Jerusalem, who saw the Fatimid instability as a golden gate to expansion. What followed was not one battle, but a brutal chess match spanning years, 3 campaigns of maneuvering, betrayal, and siege. At every turn, alliances shifted. Egyptian viziers offered power to Crusaders, then begged help from Damascus. Amalric marched to the Nile, then retreated in humiliation. Shirkuh fought, threatened, and negotiated with equal intensity. By 1169, after Shirkuh's sudden death, Saladin was unexpectedly appointed vizier of Egypt. Few expected much. He was seen as pliable, moderate, and unambitious, a perfect puppet. But Saladin was Nur ad-Din's student. He understood that power came not from appointment, but from action. Within 2 years, Saladin had reshaped Egypt. He replaced Fatimid officials with Sunni loyalists, strengthened military defenses, and began building a fleet. He ended Fatimid rule entirely in 1171, proclaiming allegiance to the Sunni Abbasid Caliph. Egypt, once Shia and independent, now stood with Nur ad-Din and Sunni Syria. The Crusaders were encircled, but this triumph also sowed the seeds of tension. Saladin now held an empire in all but name. He answered to Nur ad-Din, but Egypt was his, its wealth, its soldiers, its destiny. And in Damascus, the aging Nur ad-Din grew wary. Conflict loomed not with Crusaders, but between mentor and student. Yet fate intervened. In 1174, Nur ad-Din died unexpectedly. The man who had united Syria, inspired jihad, and resisted Christian incursion was gone, and Saladin, far from Damascus, now faced a choice: submit to Nur ad-Din's heir or stake his own claim. He chose ambition, and the balance of power in the Muslim world tilted once more. Saladin's decision to claim independence was not made lightly. He moved with caution, sending messages of loyalty to Nur ad-Din's young son while simultaneously consolidating his grip on Egypt and extending feelers into Syria. He portrayed himself as the defender of Islam, the protector of pilgrims, and the heir not in blood, but in spirit to Nur ad-Din's vision. At first, the Syrian emirs resisted. Damascus feared Egyptian dominance. Aleppo eyed him with suspicion. But Saladin knew the power of patience and propaganda. He distributed charity, repaired mosques, patronized scholars, and led prayer with humility. When he marched into Damascus in 1174, it was not with an army of conquest, but with a procession of prayer. The gates opened. The people welcomed him. Within a decade, Saladin had done what Nur ad-Din only dreamed of: uniting Egypt, Syria, parts of Mesopotamia, and the Hejaz under one banner, not through fear, but through charisma and shared purpose. He was not just a sultan, he was Salah ad-Din, the righteous of the faith, a symbol of Sunni resurgence. But he had not forgotten the Crusaders. From his base in Cairo and Damascus, Saladin launched raids into Palestine, fortifying his reputation and testing Christian resolve. He captured fortresses, disrupted trade routes, and waged a campaign not just of arms, but of ideology. Jihad was not merely a call, it was a plan. He preached unity, purpose, and the inevitability of Jerusalem's return. In the Crusader states, fear grew. Amalric was dead. His successors lacked his strategic brilliance. Jerusalem, once bold and expansionist, now trembled behind its walls. Its people remembered Edessa. They saw the tide turning. Saladin, however, bided his time. He built alliances. He waited for the right moment. And in 1187, that moment arrived. It began at a spring near a place called Hattin. But before that final, fateful clash before the horned hill and the burning fields came the death of a king, the rise of a warrior, and the march of armies that would shake Christendom. The hour approached, and Jerusalem, long held, was about to be tested. The years leading up to the fateful summer of 1187 were marked by a tense chess game between the Crusader kingdoms and Saladin's swelling empire. While Europe bickered over petty feuds and dynastic squabbles, Saladin was sharpening the blade of jihad. He strengthened his military, reinforced border fortresses, and ensured that supply lines from Egypt to Syria were efficient and protected. What truly distinguished Saladin, however, was his dual mastery of war and image. He understood that victory was not just measured on the battlefield, but also in the hearts of the people. To the Muslims of the Near East, he became a folk hero, a just ruler who prayed at dawn, shared meals with soldiers, and personally financed public works. His generosity became legend. He refused to impose excessive taxes, protected Christian pilgrims when they posed no threat, and demanded fair treatment of prisoners. Even enemies begrudgingly admired him. Within the Crusader states, meanwhile, chaos simmered beneath the surface. After the death of King Amalric, the kingdom of Jerusalem passed to his son, Baldwin IV, known as the Leper King. Baldwin ruled with surprising skill despite his illness, but as his condition worsened, so did the internal divisions of the kingdom. The nobility fractured into factions. Some favored diplomacy with Saladin, others pushed for confrontation. Chief among the hawks was Reynald of Chatillon, a ruthless and unpredictable warlord. Reynald's raids became a thorn in Saladin's side. He attacked Muslim caravans even during truce periods and boasted of plans to attack Mecca itself. For Saladin, this was more than provocation. It was sacrilege. Reynald's arrogance would not go unanswered. In 1186, Baldwin IV died, and the fragile balance of the Crusader kingdom collapsed. His heir, Baldwin V, was a child and died shortly after. Control passed to Guy of Lusignan, an ambitious but politically inept noble. His rule alienated allies and further divided the realm. Saladin watched these developments with grim satisfaction. The time was ripe. Then came Reynald's final insult. He captured a wealthy Muslim caravan, including members of Saladin's own family, and refused to release them. When envoys appealed for peace, Reynald mocked them. His defiance gave Saladin what he needed: moral and religious justification. Saladin declared war. He summoned his forces, tens of thousands of men from across the Islamic world: Kurdish cavalry, Syrian infantry, Egyptian archers, holy men and warriors alike. It was not just a military campaign, it was a righteous cause: jihad. And as the summer sun rose over the hills of Galilee, Saladin's army moved with precision. The Crusaders scrambled to respond. Under Guy of Lusignan, they gathered their forces near the springs of Safaria, uncertain whether to defend or attack. Saladin baited them. He moved toward Tiberias, a strategic town under Crusader control, knowing it would force them into action. Guy took the bait. He ordered a march under the July sun, across arid hills, without proper water supply. Saladin waited, and at the horns of Hattin, on July 4th, 1187, he unleashed a storm. The Crusader army at this point was not weak in numbers, but it was weary, disorganized, and badly led. Guy of Lusignan had surrounded himself with advisors whose ambition outpaced their judgment. Even within his own command, voices clashed. Some warned of Saladin's trap, while others, like the Templar Grand Master Gerard de Riedefort, demanded boldness. Pride won, reason lost. The march to Tiberias became a death march. The Crusaders moved slowly, dragging heavy equipment under the relentless sun. Saladin had poisoned wells and destroyed crops along their path. His cavalry skirmished on the flanks, never offering full battle, just enough to exhaust, confuse, and corral. By the time the Crusaders reached the horns of Hattin, a pair of volcanic hills overlooking the Sea of Galilee, they were parched, demoralized, and surrounded. Saladin's army encircled them. Fires were lit to fill the air with smoke. Arrows darkened the sky. Muslim infantry closed in, cutting off retreat. As the Crusaders' horses died of thirst and knights fainted from heat, panic set in. They attempted a desperate breakout, but it was too late. The slaughter was decisive. Reynald of Chatillon was captured and brought before Saladin. Offered a chance to convert. He refused. Saladin, true to his word, killed him himself, an execution viewed as justice, not vengeance. Guy of Lusignan was spared, though humiliated. The true cross, a relic carried into battle by the Crusaders, was captured. It would never be seen in the West again. The defeat at Hattin shattered the Crusader presence in the Holy Land. Castles surrendered, cities fell. Only a few strongholds, like Tyre, resisted. Saladin moved swiftly. By October, he stood before Jerusalem. The city was not prepared. Its walls were manned by civilians, priests, and a handful of knights. Panic rippled through the streets. Patriarchs prayed. Mothers wept. Some argued to flee, others to fight to the death. Balian of Ibelin, a nobleman who had sworn not to take up arms, was persuaded to lead the defense. He broke his oath after Saladin granted his family safe passage and organized the city's defense with what little he had. But everyone knew it was only a matter of time. In negotiations with Saladin, Balian pleaded for mercy. He threatened that if the city was taken by force, its people would burn the mosques, kill Muslim prisoners, and destroy the Dome of the Rock. It was a desperate bluff. Saladin, perhaps remembering the brutal sack of Jerusalem by Crusaders in 1099, chose a different path. He agreed to take the city peacefully in exchange for ransom. Those who could pay were allowed to leave. Others were enslaved. Still, Saladin showed restraint uncommon in medieval warfare. Churches were respected. The Dome of the Rock was purified but preserved. Pilgrims were not banned. The capture of Jerusalem in 1187 was not just a military victory. It was symbolic. It rewrote the narrative of the Crusades. It reminded the world, Christian and Muslim alike, that no kingdom, no relic, no holy city was untouchable. The news reached Europe like a thunderclap. The cross had fallen. The Holy Sepulchre was lost. Panic, grief, and rage surged through Christendom. And so, the stage was set for the Third Crusade. Across the Levant, the Christian settlers reeled from the loss. Their fortresses were gone, their leaders captured or killed, and their morale shattered. Many of the noble houses of the Crusader states ceased to exist in a single summer. Their legacy became that of ruin and regret. But Saladin's conquests did not mean universal peace. Though hailed as the liberator of Jerusalem, he faced the burden of governing a land fractured by war. Within his newly unified territories were Christian prisoners, restive tribes, jealous emirs, and eager allies eyeing rewards. Maintaining authority over such a diverse realm required constant diplomacy and sometimes ruthless suppression. Still, Saladin remained, in the eyes of many, a just ruler. He enforced laws that protected both Muslim and Christian civilians. He restored water systems, funded schools, and reopened trade routes. Even some Christian chroniclers, begrudgingly or admiringly, wrote of his fairness. But Europe was not content to watch the East slip from its grasp. Pope Gregory VIII, successor to the short-lived Urban III, issued a new call to arms, the Third Crusade. It would be different from the first two. This one had the weight of vengeance behind it, and the crowns of three of Europe's most powerful monarchs. From France came Philip II Augustus, calculating and politically shrewd. From England, Richard I, known to history as Richard the Lionheart, a warrior king whose reputation was as dazzling as his swordplay. And from the Holy Roman Empire, the aged but still formidable Frederick Barbarossa, who had crushed rebellions, crossed the Alps, and ruled with iron. Together, they represented the might of Western Christendom. Yet they were also rivals, bound by ambition as much as belief. Before they could clash with Saladin, they had to reach the Holy Land. That journey would prove treacherous and fatal for some. Frederick, attempting to reach the Levant overland through Anatolia, drowned while crossing a river. His death scattered his army. Many turned back. His grand vision ended in a quiet grave far from Jerusalem. Philip and Richard took to the sea. They met in Sicily, quarreled over money and women, then parted. Their alliance was already fraying, but their ships reached the Levant, their first goal Acre. The port city was under Muslim control and key to any Christian campaign. The siege of Acre would last nearly 2 years, an epic, bloody standoff that cost thousands of lives. Disease ran rampant, supplies ran low, discipline broke down, but the city fell. Its capture reignited European hope. It also exposed the divisions among the Crusaders. Philip returned to France, claiming illness. Richard remained, but not without conflict. He quarreled with Leopold of Austria, tore down his banner, and deepened the rift with the German princes. He argued with fellow Crusader lords. Even his negotiations with Saladin, conducted through messengers, were laced with mutual respect but mutual wariness. Still, Richard proved a fearsome opponent. He recaptured Jaffa. He won a brilliant victory at Arsuf. His tactics were precise, his courage undeniable. But Jerusalem remained out of reach. Each advance brought him close. But supply lines were stretched, the land was scorched, and the fear remained if they took Jerusalem. Could they hold it? Saladin, too, was weary. His forces had been fighting continuously for years. His treasury was strained. His men, though loyal, needed rest. The two leaders, Richard and Saladin, began to recognize a truth neither wanted to admit. Neither could win outright. So they negotiated. In 1192, the Treaty of Jaffa was signed. It allowed Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem. It left the city in Muslim hands, and it ended the Third Crusade. Richard sailed home. He would never return to the Holy Land. Saladin died a few months later exhausted, his empire fragile, but their duel became legend. The end of the Third Crusade marked not a conclusion, but a transition. Though Jerusalem remained under Muslim control, the coastlines of the Levant once again shimmered with Crusader banners. The fragile peace held, but just barely. Richard's departure left a void. Saladin's death left a vacuum, and into that vacuum rushed uncertainty. In the years that followed, Christian and Muslim rulers alike scrambled to rebuild their strength. Fortresses were refortified, treaties re-evaluated, alliances forged and broken in the same breath. Saladin's heirs, lacking his vision and unity, struggled to hold the Ayyubid realm together. Factionalism grew. Syria and Egypt eyed each other with suspicion. While Saladin had united under the banner of jihad, his successors ruled with the instinct of preservation. On the Christian side, the Kingdom of Jerusalem survived barely, but without its capital. Acre became the new center, a bustling port and symbol of resilience. The Latin states reconstituted themselves along the coast, fortified and wary, still dreaming of a return to the Holy City. The papacy, meanwhile, sought to harness the fervor of the faithful once more. Jerusalem was still not Christian. The crusade had not failed, but it had not succeeded. And so new plans were drawn, but enthusiasm waned. The first crusade had been marked by spiritual fire, the second by disappointment, the third by heroism tempered with political squabbles. Now, as the century turned, the church had to reframe the mission. They turned to the children, literally. In 1212, the so-called Children's Crusade swept across parts of France and Germany. Thousands of young people, many mere teenagers, claimed divine inspiration. They believed that through innocence, not arms, they could reclaim the Holy Land. What followed was tragedy. Some were turned back by local authorities. Others perished from hunger or exposure. Many were sold into slavery. The idealism of the movement, whether exaggerated or not, highlighted a growing disillusionment. Faith remained strong, but confidence in the mechanisms of war was fading. And yet, the Crusades were not over. A new generation of nobles, merchants, and adventurers began to look east, not just for redemption, but for riches. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa maritime powers saw in the cross not only salvation, but opportunity. The Fourth Crusade was born, but it would not touch the Holy Land. Its story would unfold not in Jerusalem, but in Constantinople, the seat of Eastern Christianity, the last remnant of the Roman Empire, a city of splendor, gold, and ancient glory, and soon it would burn. As the 12th century gave way to the 13th, Europe stood at a crossroads. The dream of reclaiming Jerusalem persisted, but the paths to achieving it had grown twisted, entangled in politics, greed, and opportunism. The Fourth Crusade, launched in 1202, was meant to strike at Egypt, the new heart of Muslim power. But almost immediately, the expedition veered off course. The Crusaders, lacking funds and dependent on Venetian ships, agreed to a detour they would help Venice capture the rebellious Christian city of Zara. It was a scandal. Christian knights, under the banner of the cross, sacked a Christian city under papal protection. Pope Innocent III was furious and excommunicated the lot, though the excommunication was later lifted. Still, the corruption of purpose had begun. Soon after, envoys from a deposed Byzantine prince approached the Crusaders. If they would help him reclaim the throne of Constantinople, he promised wealth, soldiers, and a united church. The offer was irresistible. In 1203, the Crusaders arrived at the gates of Constantinople. At first, the siege was political. They installed the Prince Alexios IV, only to find his promises empty. Tensions rose. The citizens of Constantinople rebelled. Fires broke out. In 1204, patience snapped. The Crusaders stormed the city. What followed was 3 days of pillage, violence, and desecration. Churches were looted, relics stolen. The great cathedral of Hagia Sophia, the jewel of Eastern Christianity, was violated. Horses stabled in its nave, chalices turned into drinking cups. The marble floor, once kissed by emperors and priests, was slick with blood. The Crusaders proclaimed a new Latin empire, carving the Byzantine state into fiefdoms, but the triumph was hollow. Constantinople was never meant to be the prize. The Holy Land lay untouched. The sack of the city shocked the Christian world. Eastern and Western churches, already strained by centuries of schism, were now sundered in blood. The Byzantines, displaced and humiliated, would never forgive. The Muslims, meanwhile, looked on in astonishment the Crusaders had done their work for them. The Fourth Crusade ended not with a clash against Islam, but with a crucifixion of Christendom itself. And yet, crusading continued. In the decades that followed, smaller expeditions tried to shore up what remained of the Crusader states. The Fifth Crusade targeted Egypt once more, but failed at the Nile. The Sixth Crusade, led by the excommunicated Emperor Frederick II, managed a diplomatic victory. Jerusalem was briefly returned to Christian hands without bloodshed, but the gains were short-lived. As Europe burned its own bridges, the Islamic world began to heal its fractures. A new power rose from the east, disciplined and devout the Mamluks of Egypt. Under leaders like Baibars and Kalawun, they systematically dismantled the Crusader presence. By the late 1200s, only a few coastal strongholds remained in Christian hands, and soon, even those would fall. Despite the humiliations of the Fourth Crusade, Europe's appetite for holy war did not vanish. The papacy, ever eager to reclaim spiritual authority and territorial dominance, continued to preach new crusades. But the nature of these campaigns was shifting, less focused on the Holy Land and more intertwined with European politics. The crusading ideal was becoming diluted. In the mid-13th century, a glimmer of the old purpose reignited. King Louis IX of France, later canonized as Saint Louis, launched the Seventh Crusade in 1248. Deeply pious, fiercely committed, and astonishingly naive. Louis believed he could succeed where others had failed. He raised funds, outfitted an army, and sailed for Egypt. Why Egypt again? Because it was now clear controlling the Nile Delta meant controlling the eastern Mediterranean. It was the supply line, the stronghold, the base from which any serious effort to retake Jerusalem could begin. At first, things went well. The Crusaders captured Damietta with surprising ease, but confidence bred carelessness. As they marched inland toward Cairo, logistics faltered. The Nile flooded, cutting off escape. The Mamluk army counterattacked. At the Battle of Al-Mansura, the Crusaders suffered a crushing defeat. Louis was captured and held for ransom. France paid dearly to retrieve their king. When Louis was finally released, he refused to return home in shame. Instead, he remained in the Holy Land for years, trying to rebuild the shattered Crusader states, fortifying castles, negotiating truces, and offering arms. But his efforts were too little, too late. By the time he left, the writing was on the wall. And yet, in 1270, Louis tried once more. This time, the Eighth Crusade was directed not at Egypt or the Levant, but at Tunis. Historians still debate the logic. Perhaps it was a strategic move to ally with the Hafsid rulers. Perhaps it was Louis's failing health and misplaced zeal. Whatever the reason, the campaign was a disaster. Louis landed, camped in the summer heat, and fell ill. Within weeks, He was dead dying not in glory, but in the dust outside Carthage. His death marked the end of an era. No more kings would lead crusades to the Holy Land. The age of noble pilgrimage had passed. Meanwhile, the Muslim world, increasingly united under the Mamluks, pressed forward. In 1268, they captured Antioch, one of the oldest Crusader cities. The massacre was brutal, churches burned, inhabitants slaughtered. The news stunned Europe, and yet, no great crusade followed. The West had grown weary. Internal wars, dynastic conflicts, and the beginnings of the Renaissance diverted energy elsewhere. Jerusalem, once the heart of Christian longing, now faded from maps and minds. Only one great bastion remained Acre. Acre, the coastal jewel of the Crusader states, stood as a final bastion of European presence in the Holy Land by the late 13th century. Its bustling port, high walls, and multicultural bazaars made it a unique blend of East and West. Merchants mingled with knights, languages overlapped, and beneath its prosperity simmered constant tension. Though officially under Christian control, Acre was a city of factions. The Templars held one quarter, the Hospitallers another. Genoese, Venetian, and Pisan traders maintained their own fortified quarters. Each group had its own loyalties, its own ambitions, and this fractured unity would prove fatal. The Mamluks, rising in power and discipline, saw Acre as the final stain of foreign occupation. Under Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil, a formidable force marched from Egypt in 1291. Unlike previous Muslim armies, the Mamluks brought not only soldiers but siege engineers, catapults, and determination honed by decades of battle. Inside Acre, panic spread. Reinforcements from Europe were minimal. Appeals to the Pope and kings went unanswered or arrived too late. The defenders, though brave, were divided and ill-prepared for a prolonged siege. The Mamluk assault was methodical. Walls crumbled, morale faltered, civilians tried to flee by sea, knights mounted desperate counterattacks, but they were overwhelmed. The city fell in bloody waves, streets ran red, and no mercy was shown. When the dust settled, Acre was in ruins. The last Crusader foothold in the Levant had fallen. With the loss of Acre, the dream of reclaiming Jerusalem died in earnest. No future crusade would ever again attempt a serious expedition to the Holy Land. The age of Crusades, at least as it had been known, was over. Yet the legacy of those wars of faith, conquest, and unintended consequences was just beginning to ripple through the centuries. Back in Europe, the fall of Acre sent shockwaves through Christendom. Clergy wept at pulpits. Monarchs issued belated calls for vengeance. Yet the fervor that had once stirred tens of thousands to take the cross had dimmed. Political rivalries, financial strain, and repeated failure had eroded the crusading spirit. But while the holy wars in the Levant faded, the crusading idea did not die. It transformed. In Spain, Christian kingdoms continued their reconquista against Muslim rule, framing it as a crusade endorsed by the Pope. In the Baltic, the Teutonic Knights fought pagans and Orthodox Christians alike, establishing their own state. Even within Europe, crusade rhetoric was turned inward against heretics, dissenters, and rivals. The Albigensian Crusade, launched against the Cathars in southern France, was particularly brutal. Entire towns were destroyed. Tens of thousands died, not for control of Jerusalem, but for doctrinal purity. Kill them all. God will know his own. A papal legate is said to have remarked. These internal crusades revealed a darker side of holy war, its use as a political and social tool, wielded not only against external enemies, but against those within. Meanwhile, in the Muslim world, the memory of the Crusades left deep impressions. While initially seen as another wave of invasions, like the Mongols or Byzantines, the persistence and brutality of the Crusaders gave rise to lasting narratives of resistance and resilience. Leaders like Saladin were lionized not only for their military prowess, but for their chivalry and unity in the face of division. Culturally, both worlds changed. Europeans returned with spices, silks, and ideas some misunderstood. Others adopted. Arab science, medicine, and philosophy trickled into European universities, translated from Greek and Arabic into Latin. In turn, Muslim chroniclers recorded both admiration and disdain for the Franks, noting their strange customs, crude manners, and fierce courage. And yet, for all the death and destruction, there were moments of coexistence. Cities where Muslims, Christians, and Jews traded, treated the sick, and shared stories. These moments were fragile, often fleeting, but real. The Crusades were not a single story, but 1,000. A patchwork of zeal and greed, of piety and brutality, of failure and transformation. As the 14th century dawned, Europe found itself reeling, not only from the losses in the Holy Land, but from internal fragmentation. Crusading zeal no longer united nations, it divided them. France and England, once allies under the Cross, were now bitter enemies in the 100 Years' War. The Church itself fractured in the Great Schism, with rival popes excommunicating one another. Yet the crusading ideal remained a potent tool wielded less as a religious calling and more as a political weapon. Popes declared crusades not just against Muslims, but against Christian kingdoms that disobeyed. One pope declared war on Venice, another on the Hussites in Bohemia. Crusading indulgences, once a sacred reward for risking one's life in the Holy Land, became commodities. Kings bought them. Nobles used them to justify private wars. Common people, still burdened by tithes and taxes, began to question. But in the East, echoes still rang. The Mamluks, who had driven out the Crusaders, held power in Egypt and Syria. Yet they too would face new enemies, the Ottomans, rising from Anatolia with a different vision of Islamic power. By the 15th century, Constantinople would fall, and with it the last bastion of Rome in the East. Some in Europe still dreamed of a new crusade. Even after centuries of bloodshed, the idea had not died, it had mutated. Columbus. In 1492, carried not just maps, but a letter for the Great Khan, hoping to convert him for a final march on Jerusalem. In truth, the age of the Crusades had ended, but its myths endured. Knights in shining armor, cities of gold, banners fluttering above holy tombs. The reality had been darker, messier, but the stories lived on. And in those stories, the lines between faith and ambition, between salvation and conquest, blurred forever. Centuries after the last crusading banner was lowered, the echoes of those campaigns still shaped Europe's soul. The Crusades had not only redrawn maps, they had redrawn minds. Art, literature, politics, and theology bore their imprint, often in ways as contradictory as the Crusades themselves. In cathedrals, stained glass windows immortalized knights kneeling before the Holy Sepulchre. In monasteries, scribes copied chronicles of glorious victories and harrowing defeats. Even as the facts faded, the symbols endured. Crusaders became figures of legend, half saints, half soldiers. In schools, the rhetoric of the crusade persisted. The notion of just war, forged in the fires of papal sermons, became a tool of kings and emperors. War was no longer merely for land or revenge, it could be sanctified. It could be righteous. But if Europe looked outward with crusading zeal, it also turned that gaze inward. Heresy, once a theological nuisance, now became a threat akin to Islam. The Cathars of southern France had already been annihilated in the Albigensian Crusade. Inquisitions now hunted belief as fervently as knights once hunted relics. Meanwhile, the Muslim world remembered differently. Where Europe saw martyrdom, they saw invasion. Where Europe saw valor, they saw brutality. Chroniclers like Ibn al-Athir and Usama ibn Munkid recorded tales of Frankish cruelty, ignorance, and stubbornness. To them, the Crusaders were both fierce and foolish barbarians at the gates, and yet, the cross-cultural contact left traces. European medicine improved with Arabic knowledge, trade expanded, new words entered Western languages, sugar, syrup, hazard, even leisure changed chest spread, and so did perfumes, spices, and silk. Still, the greatest legacy was not tangible, it was psychological. The Crusades had taught Europe that violence could be holy, that war could be a pilgrimage, that conquest could be salvation, and those ideas would not die. They would sail west with conquistadors. They would march with missionaries. They would echo in empire after empire. The Crusades had ended. But Christendom had learned to hunger not just for land, but for meaning wrapped in might. In the decades that followed the final collapse of Crusader strongholds in the Levant, European kingdoms turned inward, licking their wounds, tallying costs, and turning their gaze once more toward local ambitions. But the fire had been lit. The idea of crusade, once tied to Jerusalem's distant stones, was now a flexible instrument of power. Popes declared crusades not just against Muslims, but against political enemies, rebellious nobles, or rival claimants. The Teutonic Knights, instead of marching to the Holy Land, waged their own crusade in the Baltic, fighting pagan Lithuanians in a holy war that mixed sword and scripture. Spain's Reconquista, though centuries in the making, found new urgency and papal blessing, each victory over the Moors a spiritual triumph. The religious landscape itself transformed. Monastic orders like the Cistercians had already flourished, but now military orders grew in influence. The Knights Templar, Hospitallers, and later the Knights of Santiago and Calatrava became landowners, bankers, even diplomats. Their dual role, both monk and warrior, bewildered some and inspired others. Yet not all eyes saw glory. In poetry and play, the Crusades became material for satire and grief. Troubadours sang of lovers lost to distant wars. Chroniclers, once breathless in their praise, began to question the motives of lords and bishops who called for ever more blood in the name of Christ. Some wondered if Jerusalem had been worth it if gold, not God, had driven so many westward into slaughter. In the Islamic world, the memory remained vivid, though fragmented. While some dynasties had benefited politically from the divisions caused by Crusader incursions, others bore the scars of sacked cities and broken caliphates. Saladin, who had retaken Jerusalem, became both symbol and standard, an idealized Muslim ruler who stood for unity, justice, and resistance. His legend grew in both Islamic and Western lore, a rare figure admired on both sides of the cross. But perhaps the greatest irony of the Crusades was their long-term failure. Jerusalem remained out of Christian hands. The holy sites, so desperately sought, were never securely held. The cost in lives, in coin, in shattered relations was immense. And yet, despite this, the Crusades had succeeded in reshaping the very fabric of European identity. They made faith martial. They made war sacred. They made the world a stage upon which salvation could be fought for with steel. Even as the Crusades faded into distant memory for many, the ideologies and institutions they birthed endured. The very idea of righteous violence sanctified by papal authority had become entrenched. It gave birth to inquisitions, witch hunts, and sanctioned wars of purification within Christian lands. From France to Bohemia, the sword now cut inward. The Fourth Crusade's misdirection, culminating in the sack of Constantinople, cast a shadow across East-West relations that would never quite lift. The schism between the Latin and Orthodox churches widened. Salt poured into wounds that had barely begun to scab over. For Eastern Christians, the Crusades had not been salvation, but violation. Back in Western Europe, The returning Crusaders brought more than relics and stories. They brought spices, silks, medicines, and new ideas. Contact with Islamic scholars introduced lost Greek texts, astronomical instruments, and medical techniques far beyond the reach of most medieval universities. The seeds of the Renaissance, still centuries away, were planted in the bloody soil of Crusade. Yet the disillusionment was equally potent. The repeated failures of later Crusades, disasters like the Crusade of 1101, the Fifth Crusade's collapse in Egypt, or the farcical Children's Crusade, led many to question whether God still favoured such ventures. And when Crusaders themselves turned to looting Christian cities, raping nuns and burning libraries, the myth of holy war began to crumble. The rise of nationalist monarchies also changed the landscape. Kings like Philip IV of France viewed the church not as a partner in piety, but as a rival in politics. When the Templars became too rich, too autonomous, and too tied to international networks, they were accused of heresy, tortured, and dissolved. The age of popes calling kings to battle was waning. A new order of centralized power, secular ambition, and growing skepticism was emerging. Still, the Crusades left indelible marks, architectural styles, administrative systems, and legal precedents borrowed from Eastern encounters took root in Europe. So too did deeper fears of the other, of heresy, of contamination. Jews, already scapegoats, faced increased suspicion, massacres, and expulsions. Muslims became caricatures in sermons and plays. The rhetoric of Crusade became a tool not just of foreign conquest, but of domestic control. And in the East, the Islamic world, though victorious, would never fully forget the invasions. Fortifications along coastlines remained. The memory of Frankish aggression shaped later views of Europeans as arrogant, aggressive, yet sometimes honorable enemies. The term Franks endured in Arabic, long after the last Crusader banner fell. The crusading ideal did not die, it evolved. From the conquest of the New World to the colonization of Africa and the Middle East, echoes of Crusader justification reverberated through centuries. The language of salvation and superiority justified many a brutal campaign. So ended the age of iron-clad pilgrims, not with a final battle, but with a slow fading of banners, a shifting of priorities, and a hard-earned cynicism. The fires of Crusade had burned bright, but even as the embers cooled, they continued to smoulder in memory, in myth, and in the long, tangled roots of modern geopolitics. The Crusades, though distant in centuries, etched themselves into the very marrow of Western identity. They reshaped not only maps, but minds. The mythos they left behind outlasted their military significance. Songs, tapestries, and chronicles preserved not just facts, but fervor. In the courts of Europe, crusading became less about faith and more about fame. Knights who had never seen the Holy Land still adorned their coats with crosses. Nobles boasted of ancestors who had fought for Jerusalem, often embellishing with every telling. Even when the Holy Land was lost, its image endured a city of gold and blood, ever yearned for, never truly known. Literature absorbed these tales eagerly. From the Song of Roland to the Jerusalem Delivered, Crusaders were lionized as paragons of virtue, defenders of Christendom. Yet the contradictions mounted. How could holy men plunder? How could warriors kneel at altars stained by the blood of innocents? These tensions gave rise to new spiritual questions. Was faith about obedience or compassion? Was violence ever holy? The mendicant orders, the Franciscans, Dominicans, emerged in part as a counterweight. They preached humility over conquest, poverty over power. Their influence would ripple through theology, politics, and education for centuries. Universities, too, were shaped by Crusade. The need to justify, coordinate, and fund such vast endeavours led to more sophisticated accounting, diplomacy, and legal thought. The papal chancery became a model for later bureaucracies. And in the dusty halls of Oxford, Paris, and Bologna, scholars debated not just scripture, but strategy, sovereignty, and the rights of non-Christians. Trade, paradoxically, bloomed amid warfare. Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa profited immensely, moving troops, supplying arms, selling luxuries. Their fleets grew, their wealth expanded. Banking systems advanced to support far-flung campaigns. The foundations of capitalism were quietly laid beneath banners of the cross. But for many, the spiritual cost outweighed the material gain. When the Children's Crusade ended in disaster, thousands of youths perishing or sold into slavery, faith wavered. When the last strongholds fell and no divine rescue came, silence followed. Still, the dream lingered. Yet perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Crusades lay not in what they achieved, but in how they altered the stories people told about themselves. For centuries, rulers would invoke crusading language to sanctify wars not just against Muslims, but against fellow Christians, heretics, and eventually, entire continents. The Reconquista in Spain borrowed its fervor from Jerusalem's lost crown. So too did the conquest of the Americas, cloaked in the language of conversion and divine mission. The binary of us versus them, forged in the fires of the Holy Land, remained. It hardened across generations. It survived into colonial ideologies. It whispered in pulpits, echoed in policy. The idea of a just war, a war with divine sanction, outlived the papal bulls and rusting swords. In the Muslim world, too, memories endured. Saladin became a symbol not only of victory but of noble resistance. Westerners admired him even in defeat. Eastern poets immortalized him. And as European powers rose, expanded, and imposed, the memory of the Crusades was recalled sometimes with resentment, sometimes with resolve. A shared past, scarred and sacred, never fully healed. In art, the Crusades gave us both grandeur and grief, illuminated manuscripts, stained glass windows, and later, romantic paintings all struggled to capture their chaos. They painted knights kneeling before crosses, not corpses. Victories were glorified, defeats quietly forgotten. But beneath the surface, the truth remained. The Crusades were not triumphs, they were turbulence, movements of passion and pride, marred by contradiction. They brought Europe into closer contact with the East, but not in understanding. They opened routes for silk and spice, but closed many minds. And even now, in ruins scattered across the Levant, in castles half buried by sand, in cathedrals echoing with foreign prayers, the Crusades linger, not just in memory, but in myth, a mirror held up to the Western soul. Yet the end of the Crusades did not mark the end of their influence. In fact, their ideological framework became a template, a model used and reused by kings, popes, and emperors to justify expansion, dominance, and cultural supremacy. The language of holy war crept into royal charters. The Crusaders' cross reappeared on ships bound for the New World, carried not by knights, but by conquistadors. The blending of religious zeal and political ambition would define much of Europe's future. Monarchs claimed divine right not only to rule, but to conquer. Missionaries followed armies. Colonization wore the cloak of salvation, from the Canary Islands to Peru, from Goa to the Philippines. The rhetoric of the Crusades persisted, repurposed, reworded, but never forgotten. In literature, the Crusades became romanticized. The brutality softened, the failures reframed. Epic poems and chivalric romances featured brave Christian knights, gallant in battle, noble in love. Figures like Godfrey of Bouillon and Richard the Lionheart lived on not in dusty chronicles, but in songs and stories. Even Don Quixote, in his delusion, saw himself as a crusader. This romanticism obscured the true cost, the deaths of hundreds of thousands, the destruction of communities, the hardening of sectarian lines. It also muted the Eastern voice. Muslim chroniclers wrote of the invaders with sorrow, anger, and awe, but few of these voices reached Western ears. The history told was one-sided. In theology, too, the Crusades left their mark. The Church's authority had been wielded as a sword. Indulgences granted for bloodshed set dangerous precedents. War and piety, once separate realms, were entangled. And though reformers would later recoil at this legacy, the idea had taken root that violence, in the right hands, could be sanctified. The Crusades, therefore, did not die with the last fallen fortress. They became a ghost, lingering in doctrine and dream alike. Europe, reshaped by its forays into the Holy Land, emerged more centralized, more commercial, more self-aware, but also more entrenched in its vision of the other. And that vision would echo across centuries. For the Muslim world, the end of the Crusades brought little peace. While the Latin Christians retreated from the Holy Land, their memory remained a memory soaked in blood and fire. The invaders had come, destroyed cities, defiled mosques, and killed indiscriminately. Their departure was not a victory, but a wound, deep, unhealed, and ever vulnerable to assault. Yet, paradoxically, the Crusades had also strengthened Muslim unity. The fragmented emirates and sultanates, often at odds with each other, had found a common enemy in the Franks. Leaders like Nur ad-Din and Saladin were revered not only for their military skill, but for embodying the hope of a united ummah. Their legacy echoed in minarets and madrasas, shaping Islamic thought and identity. In the Jewish world, the scars ran even deeper. The First Crusade had unleashed pogroms across the Rhineland, with entire communities of Jews massacred by mobs who believed their journey to Jerusalem must begin with purging infidels at home. Synagogues were burned, Torah scrolls torn, families slaughtered, and though some church officials condemned the violence, many did nothing or arrived too late. This pattern repeated itself. Each new crusade stirred fear. In England, the Third Crusade saw riots in York. In France, Spain, and Germany, rumors of Jewish betrayal led to persecution. Jews were forced to wear identifying badges, banned from guilds, and barred from land ownership. The crusading spirit, once aimed outward, turned inward against those within Christendom who were deemed impure. Yet through all this, Jewish scholars continued to write. Rashi, Maimonides, and others laid foundations that would endure centuries. Their resilience became legend, their endurance, testament. Meanwhile, Byzantium, once a beacon of Christianity in the East, suffered a slow and bitter decline. The Fourth Crusade had gutted it. Though Constantinople was retaken from the Latins in 1261, it never truly recovered, weakened, divided, and economically crippled. The Byzantine Empire limped toward its final days. In 1453, it fell not to Crusaders, but to the Ottomans, and with that fall, the Crusades were bookended. Their first spark had come from the East's cry for help. Their legacy ended with the East extinguished. The irony was sharp, and yet the story did not end, because the ideas remained. In Europe, the cultural echoes of the Crusades were not mournful. They were triumphant, romanticized, and most of all, recycled. Chronicles of heroic knights, divine visions, and righteous battles filled manuscripts and monastic libraries. The Crusader became a mythic figure, woven into chivalric romances and courtly tales. Songs of Roland, legends of the Templars, and tales of sacred quests shaped the imagination of generations. Even when the real Crusades had failed, their stories succeeded. They offered a world of clear good and evil, a moral simplicity wrapped in chainmail. Kings invoked the crusading spirit for wars that had little to do with Jerusalem. The Albigensian Crusade targeted fellow Christians in southern France, branding them heretics and seizing their lands. The Reconquista in Spain, a centuries-long effort to reclaim Iberia from Muslim rule, borrowed crusading rhetoric liberally. Even the Baltic campaigns, fought against pagan tribes, were declared holy wars. And for the Church, the Crusades were a tool, a blunt, powerful instrument for rallying the faithful, directing violence, and expanding influence. Indulgences, once tied strictly to penance, now became currency for warfare. Fight for God, and your sins were absolved. It was theology made weapon, but cracks began to show. As crusades multiplied, their purpose diluted. People questioned the mixing of piety with pillage. They noticed that the poor suffered while the rich profited, that God's will often aligned too neatly with noble ambition. Dissenters whispered, some openly spoke, reformers, mystics, and early critics began to challenge the Church's authority, pointing to the corruption and moral compromise that the Crusades had both revealed and accelerated. The Crusades were not just wars, they were mirrors. In them, Christendom saw its hopes and hypocrisies, its valor and violence, its saints and sinners. And while Jerusalem remained sacred, it was no longer central. The map of Europe was changing, power was shifting, ideas were stirring, and though the age of crusades was ending, the age of empires was just beginning. In the aftermath, one could walk through the bones of Antioch and feel the weight of failure. Cities that once rang with the clang of armor and the chants of prayer were now quiet ruins. Some were reclaimed by local powers. Others simply faded, remembered only in fading parchment, and the fading memory of men who returned, changed, or not at all. And yet, even defeat bore fruit. In Italy, port cities like Genoa and Venice, who had profited immensely from crusading logistics and trade, funneled that wealth into art, architecture, and the foundations of what would become the Renaissance. In Spain, the momentum of crusading energy fed the final push against Al-Andalus, culminating in 1492 with the fall of Granada. And knowledge quiet, persistent, dangerous, crept in through the cracks. Medical texts, ancient Greek philosophy preserved by Muslim scholars, astronomical observations all began to circulate, translated from Arabic into Latin. They challenged the intellectual monopoly of the Church. They opened doors that centuries of dogma had kept shut, but there was also fear. The Crusades had introduced Europe to a vast world, sophisticated, diverse, powerful, and it had not always triumphed. That realization, though unspoken, left a scar. In response, European identity hardened. Heretics were persecuted more fiercely. Witch trials gained traction. Unity was sought through exclusion. And in the East, wounds festered. The Byzantine Empire, weakened by the very crusaders meant to protect it, would never fully recover. Its fall in 1453 to the Ottoman Turks marked a turning of the age. Constantinople, renamed Istanbul, became a jewel in the Islamic world. The Latin Christian dream of owning Jerusalem evaporated, and with it, the idea that righteousness guaranteed victory. The world was more complex, more brutal, less predictable. The Crusades did not save Christendom, but they reshaped it. They taught it to trade, to fight, to question, to conquer. And in those lessons soaked in blood and sanctified in memory, the foundations of modern Europe were laid. Meanwhile, for those who had survived whether as soldiers, pilgrims, or profiteers, the return home was complicated. Many found their villages changed, their names forgotten, their sacrifices misunderstood. Some brought back exotic goods and stories. Others brought trauma. Some returned embittered, questioning the very faith that had led them to the desert. The literature of the time began to reflect this. Chronicles once glowing with divine approval turned more cynical. The age of the knight-errant began to fray. Poets wrote of lost causes, unrequited quests, and moral ambiguity. The romanticized crusader became a more ambiguous figure, brave, yes, but also tragic, haunted, even foolish. In religious life, the papacy itself reeled. The loss of Jerusalem a second time could not be ignored. Confidence in papal leadership waned. The moral authority of Rome, already under pressure from internal corruption and external critics, began to crack. Heresies took root: Cathars in the south of France, Hussites in Bohemia. Reformist voices grew louder. Economic shifts were more immediate. The Crusades had opened new trade routes and spurred demand for Eastern goods, spices, silks, dyes. Merchant classes gained power. Feudal lords who had sold land to fund expeditions found themselves impoverished or dependent on cash-rich city-states. The balance of power began to tilt. Socially, the rigid hierarchy of medieval Europe loosened, if only slightly. Exposure to other cultures, other systems, and new ideas had widened horizons. Travel, once the domain of nobles and pilgrims, became a tool for merchants and adventurers. The concept of Christendom, once geographically vague and spiritually unified, fractured into more practical concerns: who controlled what, and at what cost. And through it all, Jerusalem remained, still fought over, still holy, still symbolic. A city of stone that bore the weight of so many prayers, so many corpses. The Crusades did not bring peace, but they left behind a map of the future. In the Muslim world, the Crusades also left enduring impressions. While the initial invasions had been seen as brutal and alien, over time they became part of a longer narrative of resistance and unity. Figures like Saladin were remembered not only for their military genius, but also for their mercy and diplomacy. The idea of jihad, which had been largely dormant, was revived not only as a military concept, but as a spiritual rallying cry. Chroniclers in Damascus, Cairo, and Baghdad began to incorporate tales of Frankish incursions into their histories, framing them as both a challenge and a test. Islamic jurisprudence responded with rulings on prisoners, trade with Christians, and treatment of foreign envoys. Cultural exchanges, though strained, occurred nonetheless. Some Islamic scholars noted European ignorance with pity, others saw opportunity in their confusion. In Byzantium, the Crusades proved a slow poison. While the First Crusade had passed through with promises of aid, later ones especially, the Fourth left scars that would never fully heal. The sacking of Constantinople in 1204 by fellow Christians was a betrayal the Orthodox world could not forget. It accelerated the schism between Eastern and Western Christianity and weakened the Byzantine Empire beyond repair. Western Europe, for its part, absorbed aspects of Eastern knowledge. Medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and architecture saw subtle but significant influences. Arabic numerals replaced Roman ones. Translations of Aristotle and Galen filtered into universities. The domes and pointed arches seen in the Holy Land found echoes in European cathedrals. But not all was enlightenment. Some brought home only superstition and fear. Tales of Muslim cruelty, often exaggerated or fabricated, were used to justify further violence. A new kind of religious rigidity took root. Heresy was hunted with renewed fervor. The Inquisition, initially aimed at Cathars and Jews, found inspiration in the tools of the Crusades. Even language changed. Crusade became shorthand for righteous violence. The term itself, cruciata, from the cross, was applied to campaigns not only in the Levant, but also in Spain, the Baltic, and against fellow Christians deemed impure. The spiritual justification for war had become portable, flexible, and disturbingly durable. In the realm of art and literature, the Crusades inspired epics, romances, and legends. The Song of Roland, the Chanson d'Antioche, tales of King Richard and Saladin all blended history with myth. These stories taught valor, loyalty, and faith, but also, subtly, the dangers of pride, ambition, and blind obedience. The Holy Land, meanwhile, remained contested. Fortresses crumbled, orders dissolved. Pilgrims still traveled, but the paths grew more dangerous. The last Crusader stronghold fell in 1291. Acre, once a glittering hub, was reduced to rubble. The dream of a Christian kingdom in the east died hard. But die it did, and in its place, questions rose like dust. What had it all been for the Knights Templar? Once the elite defenders of Christian pilgrims and the keepers of vast wealth, fell spectacularly, accused of heresy, blasphemy, and corruption. They were arrested en masse in 1307 by order of King Philip IV of France, who was deeply indebted to them. Under torture, confessions were extracted, and the order was dissolved by Pope Clement V in 1312. Its leaders were burned at the stake, their wealth seized, and their legacy plunged into legend, mystery, and conspiracy. Their fall signaled a turning point. The crusading spirit, once lionized, was now suspect. The alignment of religious fervor and economic ambition had begun to erode trust in the moral purity of such ventures. No longer were these campaigns viewed universally as righteous. They became entangled with politics, power, and greed. The Teutonic Knights shifted focus from the Holy Land to Eastern Europe, engaging in brutal campaigns against pagan tribes in Prussia and Lithuania. These crusades, waged under the same cross banner, lacked the spiritual romance of the earlier wars. They were colonization efforts, marked by forced conversions and land seizures, foreshadowing the expansionist empires to come. In Spain, the Reconquista gained renewed vigor. Christian kingdoms pressed southward, reclaiming territory from Muslim rulers. Here, crusading rhetoric was effectively localized. Popes granted indulgences to those fighting in Iberia, framing the struggle not as distant war, but as a holy duty on home soil. The end of Muslim rule in Granada in 1492 marked the culmination of this campaign, coinciding with the dawn of the Age of Exploration. Meanwhile, the Holy Sepulchre remained in Muslim hands, its gates still opened to pilgrims, though now under carefully negotiated truces. Jerusalem did not vanish from Christian consciousness, but its role changed. No longer a military goal, it became a spiritual symbol, a reminder of glory lost, of promises unfulfilled, and of the weight of history. As Europe transitioned from medieval to early modern, the memory of the Crusades began to shift. In some circles, it became romanticized knights in shining armor, noble quests, divine favor. In others, it became a cautionary tale about fanaticism, failure, and the cost of mixing church with sword. The Protestant Reformation further complicated the picture. Reformers like Martin Luther viewed the Crusades with skepticism, even scorn. They denounced the sale of indulgences, the corruption of the papacy, and the bloody legacy of holy war. In Catholic regions, however, the idea of crusade lingered as spiritual metaphor, as imperial justification, as sacred tradition. And in the Islamic world, the term crusader took on new weight. It became not just a descriptor of medieval conflict, but a symbol of Western aggression revived in colonial narratives, in nationalist histories, and in the rhetoric of resistance. The Crusades never truly ended. They evolved, reinterpreted by each age to fit its fears, its hopes, and its enemies, and their echoes still shape us. The loss of Jerusalem in 1187 was a wound that never quite healed. Even as Christian armies attempted to reclaim it in the Third, Fourth, and later Crusades, none succeeded in restoring lasting control. The city became a symbol not just of spiritual longing, but of defeat, of the limitations of Western might when faith was untempered by strategy. In the universities of Europe, scholars began to reflect differently. Thomas Aquinas and others wrote of just war, of divine justice, but also of human fallibility. Clerics, once the loudest cheerleaders for Crusade, grew quieter. The rise of scholasticism introduced a new lens, more philosophical, more skeptical. And still, ordinary people remembered. Ballads were sung about knights who never returned. Tapestries depicted victories long faded. Pilgrims, ever faithful, continued to walk toward Rome, Santiago, and Jerusalem, seeking not conquest, but connection. By the 15th century, the age of the traditional crusade was effectively over. Yet the notion of holy war found new forms. The Inquisition, the conquest of the Americas, the battle cries of religious empires all drew, in part, from crusading roots. The idea that war could be sacred, that violence could be redemptive, had sunk deep into the soil of European thought. And in that soil, new empires grew. Yet even as the dust of failed campaigns settled over centuries, the Crusades continued to echo. Not just in scripture or sermons, but in policy and prejudice, architecture and art. Across Europe, the symbols of the Crusader age became embedded into daily life. Crosses adorned shields and standards. Cathedrals bore relics brought from the East, and local legends absorbed tales of valor, often exaggerated and rarely questioned. The idea of pilgrimage and crusade merged in cultural memory. To journey, to suffer, to fight these became intertwined motifs in medieval storytelling. In towns from York to Palermo, mystery plays and poems blurred biblical tales with the exploits of knights who had marched under banners of God. In the Islamic world, too, memory endured. The Crusaders were not forgotten. Chroniclers like Ibn al-Qalanisi and Ibn al-Athir recorded their incursions, celebrated defenders like Zengi and Saladin, and warned of future invasions. In some regions, the word Frank would remain a byword for foreign aggression for generations. Meanwhile, trade routes expanded. Ironically, the Crusades helped establish lasting commercial links between Christian and Muslim worlds. Italian merchant republics, Venice, Genoa, Pisa grew wealthy on contracts forged during campaigns, shipping weapons eastward and spices westward, often supplying both sides of the conflict. Silk, sugar, and citrus became everyday items in noble courts thanks to these wartime exchanges. This mingling of commerce, culture, and conquest left a mark far deeper than battlefields. Europeans developed tastes and technologies that had originated in the East Arabic numerals, astrolabes, medical texts, navigational charts. Libraries in Spain translated Islamic works into Latin. Scholars discovered Aristotle anew through Muslim commentators. But the cost was great. Whole generations were lost. Economies in some regions drained to fund expeditions. Entire villages emptied of young men. Resources poured into campaigns that yielded no lasting peace. And worst of all, an idea had taken root that salvation could be bought with blood. The Crusades did not create religious intolerance, but they deepened it. Jews suffered massacres from the Rhine Valley to England during Crusader mobilizations. Muslims in the Levant bore the brunt of repeated invasions. Even Eastern Christians, supposedly allies, were mistrusted and at times attacked. The Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople in 1204 was not an aberration, it was a symptom. A civilization claiming to follow the Prince of Peace had baptized war, and the consequences rippled outward, shaping not just history, but identity. In medieval art and song, the Crusades became idealized. Troubadours sang of knights slain under foreign suns, martyrs in steel who fought not for gold, but for God. These were stories stripped of horror and made noble in verse. but for those who had lived it, or whose families bore the scars. The tales rang hollow. Memory is not always poetic. Still, many believed. Crusading orders, like the Knights Templar and Hospitallers, gained immense power and wealth, forming quasi-independent states within kingdoms. They built fortresses across Europe and the Holy Land, recruited warriors, and governed with a blend of martial law and monastic discipline. Their rise and eventual fall, especially the dramatic suppression of the Templars in the early 1300s, became legends in their own right. Back in Europe, relics of the Crusades took tangible form. Churches claimed to house thorns from Christ's crown, drops of his blood, even fragments of the true cross. Some were brought back by knights, others were sold, faked, or misunderstood. Pilgrims came in droves. Faith and the desire to be near the holy still burned, but questions had begun to smolder beneath the surface. Was the bloodshed worth it? Why had so many died, only for Jerusalem to be lost and retaken, again and again? Did God truly sanction the horrors witnessed from the sack of cities to the massacre of innocents? By the late 13th century, these doubts began to show. Popes called for more crusades, but the enthusiasm waned. Nobles remembered the debts more than the glory. Merchants weighed profit against pilgrimage. The people, taxed and weary, no longer cheered. And still, the fires of the past glowed. In Spain and Portugal, the Reconquista, seen by many as a local crusade, gained momentum. As Christian kingdoms pushed southward, driving out Muslim rule, they borrowed rhetoric, tactics, and symbols from the Eastern Crusades. The cross and the sword marched westward now, carving out new Christian realms. In the Baltic, another crusade burned. The Teutonic Knights waged holy war against pagan tribes of Prussia and Lithuania. Conversion by the blade replaced dialogue. Fortresses rose in ice and snow, their banners echoing those once raised in Antioch and Acre. These wars were not footnotes, they were continuations. Europe had learned to crusade, and it would not forget how. Yet beyond banners and bloodshed, the Crusades left behind subtler legacies, legacies not measured in territory or tribute, but in thought and transformation. Contact with the Islamic world exposed Europeans to knowledge that had been preserved and expanded during the so-called Dark Ages of the West. From the libraries of Damascus and Cairo came translations of Greek philosophers, commentaries by Arab scholars, and advancements in medicine, mathematics, and astronomy. Paper replaced parchment. Arabic numerals replaced Roman ones, ushering in new systems of accounting, architecture, and science. It was not conquest alone that changed Europe, but proximity to civilizations that had never stopped thinking. Trade, too, surged in the Crusades' wake. Italian ports flourished. Venice, Genoa, Pisa acting as gateways between East and West. Spices, silks, dyes, and sugar flowed inland. So did ideas, so did ambition. The Mediterranean became a highway not just for merchants, but for explorers and adventurers whose dreams reached beyond maps. This new awareness challenged the old world view. The church remained powerful, but cracks appeared in its monopoly over knowledge. Universities grew. Philosophy questioned tradition. Skepticism stirred, tentatively, like a seed pushing through stone. Meanwhile, those who had returned from the East Pilgrims and Knights, beggars and bishops, found themselves changed. Some were haunted, some inspired, some enraged at what they had seen. Their stories, passed in whispers and fireside tales, became warnings and wonders alike. For the Muslim world, the Crusades were remembered differently, not as spiritual epics, but as foreign invasions periods of violence and disruption. The memory lingered, shaping attitudes toward the West long after the last knight sailed home. Mosques destroyed, communities shattered, libraries looted. These scars never faded entirely. For the Jewish communities caught between worlds, the Crusades brought catastrophe, pogroms in Europe, massacres en route to the Holy Land, blame, scapegoating, and expulsion. Centuries of tension flared into cruelty. The memory of betrayal and blood would endure, long after Jerusalem's walls crumbled. And in the Holy Land itself, the land did not forget. The stones of Acre, the broken towers of Tyre, the ghostly chapels in desert winds, they bore silent witness to an age of collision. Pilgrims still came, though fewer. The cross still stood, but beside it now lay the memory of swords. By the dawn of the 14th century, the crusading era was not over, but it was transforming. It was no longer a call to save Jerusalem. It became a habit of politics, a tool of kings, a symbol reshaped to suit new ends. The spirit remained, but the substance had shifted, and thus the fire dimmed but never died. Long after the swords rusted and the banners were folded away, the Crusades refused to fade from memory. They echoed through sermon, song, painting, and politics. What had begun as a holy war became, over time, something else entirely: a myth, a mirror, and a mask. In medieval Europe, the Crusades were romanticized. Troubadours sang of valor and martyrdom. Chronicles recorded noble deeds, omitting the butchered towns and broken oaths. The knight in shining armor, defending the faith, this became the image that endured. The complex truths, the greed, the failures, the hypocrisies were softened or forgotten. And the church, it institutionalized the idea. Crusading became an indulgence, a way to earn salvation. Later campaigns, launched against heretics within Europe Cathars. Hussites borrowed the language of the Crusade, if not its original intent. The sword once raised for Jerusalem was now turned inward, wielded against fellow Christians. In the Muslim world, the memory took longer to solidify. Initially, the Crusaders were seen not as existential enemies, but as temporary invaders, brutal, yes, but beatable. It was only in the modern era, as colonialism echoed the violence of the past, that the Crusades were reframed as a pivotal humiliation, a symbol of Western aggression. The word crusade itself took on a bitter edge. And what of the Jews, caught in the maelstrom? Their memory was one of pain. The Rhineland massacres of 1096 marked a beginning. Expulsions followed, stereotypes hardened, and yet stories survived. Prayers were written, laments sung, hope persisted. In literature, the Crusades inspired both chivalric fantasy and brutal realism. Dante placed crusaders in heaven, Cervantes mocked them, Tasso glorified, Voltaire criticized. In every era, writers reimagined the Crusades to reflect their time, sometimes as moral tales, sometimes as cautionary fables. Even today, their legacy lingers. Politicians invoke crusading language, knowingly or not. Extremists draw lines of vengeance that stretch back to the 12th century. History becomes ammunition, memory, a battlefield. Yet amid all this, the human truth remains. The Crusades were not a clash of civilizations. They were collisions of people flawed, frightened, fervent. Some sought glory, some forgiveness. Some came to kill, some to heal. And many, swept up in tides beyond their control, came only to die. The story of the Crusades is not one story. It is many. It is complicated, contradictory, and deeply human. And it is not over. As the centuries rolled on, the physical remnants of the Crusades crumbled. Fortresses fell to ruin. The bones of forgotten soldiers dissolved into the soil, but their ideological traces remained vibrant and volatile. In classrooms, pulpits, and political rallies, the Crusades were invoked again and again. often far removed from their original context. During the Enlightenment, European philosophers looked back on the Crusades with a mixture of scorn and curiosity. To minds shaped by reason, the idea of thousands marching under divine banners to claim distant lands seemed both tragic and absurd. Voltaire saw in them a testament to human folly, and Gibbon wove them into his grand narrative of imperial decline and religious delusion. The Crusades, in this era, were no longer sacred, just spectacular examples of misguided zeal. But not all reflections were cynical. The 19th century, with its romantic turn, breathed new life into crusading imagery. Painters and poets turned knights into icons of nobility and sacrifice. In Victorian England and Napoleonic France, the medieval crusader became a symbol of national identity, brave, pure, Christian. History was tailored to flatter. This romanticism bled into colonial ambitions. As European powers carved up the Middle East, echoes of crusading justification returned. The French claimed ties to Frankish knights. The British spoke of civilizing missions. The shadow of the cross worn now as metaphor fell once more over the Levant. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, the slow-burning memory of the Crusades began to kindle into something more potent. In the early 20th century, as empires collapsed and nations formed, the Crusades were reframed not as ancient history, but as precedent, a prototype for the West's continued interference. The figure of Salah ad-Din, once admired even in Europe for his chivalry, became a symbol of righteous resistance. By the time the modern age unfolded, the Crusades had transcended history entirely. They had become mythic, weaponized. Extremist groups, both Christian and Muslim, invoked them with grim enthusiasm. Politicians stumbled into the language of holy war, often unaware of the layers they unearthed. Crusade became a word heavy with blood. In cinema, the Crusades were rendered in sweeping spectacle. Hollywood favored the grand and glorious, the clash of swords, the thunder of horses, the storming of castles. Rarely did these portrayals show the starvation, the disillusionment, the rot that crept into every campaign. Reality, as ever, was more complex than fiction. In academic circles, revisionist histories emerged. Scholars re-evaluated sources, uncovered new voices, Arab chroniclers, Jewish accounts, women's perspectives. The binary of good versus evil crumbled. Nuance returned. But in the public imagination, the Crusades remained caught between extremes: sacred quest or savage conquest. And yet, perhaps that is fitting. The Crusades were never simple. They were born of faith and fear, greed and guilt. They were quests for absolution and opportunities for power. They united empires and shattered kingdoms. They left graves and legends, ruins and revelations. In the end, the most enduring legacy of the Crusades may not be in the ground once trodden by armored feet, but in the minds of those who continue to tell the tale. For history, unlike stone, does not erode. It mutates. It haunts. It teaches when we let it. In the 21st century, the legacy of the Crusades remains active, even if subtly embedded in the structures of geopolitics and cultural consciousness. Schools still teach them, albeit through revised syllabi seeking to balance multiple viewpoints. Documentaries dissect them, novels dramatize them, and in some corners of the internet, the imagery is revived, misused, misunderstood, often in dangerously simplified form. It is this simplification that poses the greatest risk. To reduce the Crusades to a clash between Christianity and Islam is to ignore the layers of local politics, of internal dissent, of competing motives among kings, popes, and commoners. The Crusaders themselves were not a monolith. They fought each other as often as they fought their supposed enemies. Alliances shifted, betrayals abounded. Faith was real, but so was ambition. And those left behind wives, children, debt-ridden families faced the long aftermath of decisions made in distant castles. The crusading ideal demanded sacrifice not just of life, but of livelihood. For every knight who returned with riches, hundreds did not return at all. Even today, some religious institutions commemorate the Crusades less as calls to arms, and more as symbols of endurance, of pilgrimage, of faith tested in fire. The original theological rationale has largely faded, but the imagery persists. Crosses in architecture, names in stone, prayers for peace in places once steeped in war. Meanwhile, interfaith dialogues attempt to bridge the gap left by centuries of misunderstanding. Conferences, cultural exchanges, and historical re-evaluations all aim to replace swordplay with speech. Historians urge a move from glorification to reflection. The Crusades, they say, must be studied not for inspiration, but for instruction. And what is that instruction that belief, when wedded to unchecked power, can justify almost anything? That memory is fragile, and when bent by ideology, can become a weapon. That myth, once forged in fire, is hard to extinguish. Yet also, that history is not fate. That by confronting the past honestly, we can reshape the future with compassion. As pilgrims once trudged dusty roads toward distant shrines, modern seekers walk different paths toward understanding, toward reconciliation, toward a world where stories do not have to end in siege or sacrifice. The Crusades are over, but their echoes will linger until we choose to listen and to learn. The scars of the Crusades extend beyond ruined battlements and lost chronicles. They exist in the language we use, the myths we inherit, and the silences we still carry. For many in the modern Middle East, the memory of crusading armies remains tied not to theology, but to colonial echoes, foreign powers arriving under banners, preaching righteousness, imposing new orders. For many in the West, the Crusades have faded into legend, or worse, into unexamined symbols. There are still those who wear the cross of the Crusader without understanding its cost. Art and culture have played no small part in shaping these legacies. From Tasso's Jerusalem Delivered to modern cinema, the Crusades have been romanticized, criticized, reinterpreted. Each age tells the story it wants to hear. In medieval Europe, they were epics of faith. In Enlightenment salons, cautionary tales of fanaticism. In the colonial era, justification for empire. And now, they often serve as allegories of struggle, of loss, of endurance. But beneath all this, the human stories remain. The child waiting at the gates for a father who never returned. The scribe recording the death of yet another monk felled by disease in a faraway land. The merchant who survived the siege and rebuilt his life selling spices in Cairo. These are not myths. These were people, and their voices, if faint, still speak. Archaeologists today uncover more than relics. They unearth lives. A Crusader cemetery in the Levant, a hoard of coins buried in panic, a chapel wall with prayers etched in Latin, untouched for centuries. These fragments do not glorify, they testify to movement, to contact, to conflict, to coexistence. Academic efforts now seek to decentralize the narrative, to include the Armenian defenders, the Kurdish guides, the Syrian craftsmen, the Coptic hosts, to show that history was never binary, that lines drawn on maps cannot divide the complexity of shared lives. And as history moves forward, the Crusades have become a mirror more than a map. They reflect our fears, our hopes, our capacity to divide, and our ability to reconcile. They show that righteousness can blind, that zeal can burn, but also that healing is possible. So let this story close not with a banner raised, but with a question asked. What will we do with what we remember? Will we carry swords? Or stories will we build walls? Or bridges will we repeat? Or rethink? The past cannot be undone, but it can be understood. And from that understanding, perhaps just perhaps peace can be crafted, like the delicate glass once traded between East and West. fragile, beautiful, and made by hand. Long after the last knight laid down his sword, the Crusades continued to echo in sermons and stories, in the architecture of fortified churches, and in the laws of newly shaped kingdoms. The ideas born during those centuries of holy war, of religious identity, of cultural supremacy, did not vanish. They merely evolved. In Europe, returning crusaders were often treated as heroes, granted land, or given places of honor. Some brought back more than scars and relics. They brought new crops, musical instruments, Arabic texts, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy flowed back through Sicily and Spain into the West, reframing the intellectual world of Europe. Ironically, what began as a campaign of exclusion became a bridge for knowledge. In the Islamic world, the Crusades were rarely remembered in the same dramatic terms until the colonial period. When European powers again arrived with banners and guns, then the memory was reawakened, reinterpreted. Saladin became a symbol not only of military victory, but of unity and resistance. The narrative sharpened. Today, in politics and media, references to the Crusades still surface, often misused, often divorced from nuance. They're invoked as insults, as warnings, as rallying cries. But to study them deeply is to see complexity, contradiction, and consequence. It is to see shared pain and shared responsibility, and still, the sacred sites remain. Jerusalem, with its layered holiness. Antioch, now Antakya, where echoes whisper beneath modern stones. Acre, whose harbour saw the end of the Crusader dream. Pilgrims walk these places, still some seeking God, some seeking history, all treading paths carved by centuries of faith and fire. In every ruined castle, every worn prayer book, there is a choice: to see enemies or ancestors, to see conquest or caution, to remember with clarity or with purpose. Because the Crusades were not just events, they were turning points, and the turn, once taken, never truly stops. But beyond the grand narratives and military campaigns, the Crusades were lived most deeply by those whose names were never written down. The villagers of Palestine, the traders of Damascus, the sailors of Genoa, the weavers of Flanders. For them, the Crusades were not a theological debate, but a storm that broke over their heads. In the Levant, entire communities adapted to survive successive waves of conquest. Local Christians, Eastern Orthodox and Jacobite, often found themselves caught between Catholic crusaders and Muslim rulers. Some sought protection, others switched allegiances, and many simply endured. Their churches still stand in quiet testament. Jewish communities, meanwhile, bore heavy scars. In the Rhineland massacres of the First Crusade, entire towns of Jews were slaughtered by mobs seeking to cleanse before setting out to the Holy Land. These massacres marked some of the earliest instances of large-scale anti-Jewish violence in Europe, and the trauma would shape Jewish memory for centuries. In Egypt and Syria, Muslim chroniclers recorded the invasions with a mix of outrage and resignation. Some saw the Franks as brutal barbarians, others as foolish but persistent foes. Still, there was admiration too, particularly for their fortifications, their resolve, and their peculiar codes of honor. Even the Mamluks, who eventually expelled the last Crusaders from their coastal fortresses, absorbed some of their architectural techniques and battle tactics. The clash left its marks on both sides, not only in ruins and graves, but in ideas, strategies, and imaginations. Art and literature, too, absorbed the Crusades. European chansons de geste romanticized them, turning knights into saints and sieges into epics. Muslim poetry, meanwhile, mourned the loss of holy cities and celebrated victories with fervent faith. Both traditions cultivated legends of martyrdom, of miracles, of monsters beyond the sea. In truth, the Crusades were neither wholly noble nor wholly vile. They were human. They were full of hope and horror, valor and vanity. They were born of conviction, but fed by ambition. And as with all human endeavors, they defy simple judgment. In modern times, the Crusades have become symbolic used by extremists on all sides to justify hatred or vengeance. But history is not a weapon, it is a mirror. It shows us who we were and who we risk becoming again. To remember the Crusades is to walk a narrow path, to honor faith without excusing fanaticism, to recognize courage without glorifying conquest, to see the past, not as a tale of sides, but as a tapestry of choices. And as long as that tapestry survives, so too does the chance to learn. And so the Crusades came to a close, not with a single moment of triumph or surrender, but with a long, quiet fading. The great castles crumbled, the orders of knights dissolved or retreated, and the cross was lowered from the towers along the eastern shore. What remained was not glory, but silence. Not a holy kingdom, but memory. For some, that memory was sacred, an echo of divine purpose and sacrifice. For others, it was a wound, a scar left by centuries of violence and zeal. But for all, it shaped the world we inherited. Borders shifted, empires rose, trust eroded. And in every corner of Europe and the Middle East, something of those wars lingered, sometimes buried, sometimes burning. Today, the Crusades live on not in swords or banners, but in stories, in cathedrals and minarets, in the dusty corners of manuscripts, in the stones of forgotten walls, and in the questions we still ask. What drives people to war in God's name? What is lost when faith becomes weapon? And what remains when the armies go home? Perhaps, in the end, the greatest legacy of the Crusades is this: a reminder that history is made not only by kings and knights, but by every soul who walks through its fire. That belief, while powerful, must walk humbly. That peace is harder to win than war, but infinitely more worthy. Thank you for listening. Sleep well, and dream not of swords, but of understanding.